It started late on a Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet night where the internet usually just hums along with silly videos and pictures of cats. But then something changed. A post popped up on a social media platform that stopped everyone from scrolling. It wasn't a headline from a big news station. It was just a short, blurry message from someone who claimed to have a cousin working at a hospital in Los Angeles. The message was simple, but it hit like a heavy weight. It said that Keanu Reeves was in the intensive care unit. It said things were not looking good. At first, people didn't want to believe it. We have all seen fake news before. We have all heard rumors about celebrities that turned out to be silly mistakes. But this one felt different. Maybe it was because of who he was. Keanu isn't just an actor who makes movies and then disappears. He is the kind of person who feels like a friend to the world, even if you have never met him. So, when the words ICU appeared next to his name, a cold feeling went to the hearts of millions of people almost instantly. The post didn't have many details. It was vague. It just said he had been rushed in, and that doctors were working hard to keep him stable. That was the spark that lit the fire. Within minutes, the post was being shared everywhere. It moved from small fan pages to big public discussions. People were waking up their friends and family, asking, "Did you hear the news? Is it true? Is he okay?" The digital world, which is usually full of arguments and noise, suddenly became united in one feeling: pure, unfiltered worry. What made the fear grow so fast was the silence. In the beginning, there was no denial. There was no statement from a manager or a post on his official page. That silence allowed the imagination of the public to run wild. When we don't know the truth, our brains often go to the scariest possible place. People started remembering the stunts he has done. They remembered him jumping off buildings, crashing motorcycles, and fighting bad guys on screen. We see him as the invincible hero, the one who never gives up. But this rumor reminded everyone that he is human. He is made of bone and flesh, just like the rest of us. As the hours ticked by, the rumor grew arms and legs. It changed shape as it traveled from one phone screen to another. Some people said it was a heart attack. Others said it was a terrible accident on a movie set. People started piecing together his recent schedule, looking for clues. He looked tired in that last interview. Someone commented, "He lost a lot of weight for that role." Another person worried. The internet became a detective board, trying to solve a mystery that nobody actually wanted to solve. The atmosphere online was heavy. It wasn't like when a celebrity does something controversial and everyone argues. This was a collective holding of breath. You could feel the anxiety through the screen. Strangers were comforting each other in comment sections. They were sharing their favorite moments of him being kind. Stories of him giving up his seat on the subway, or buying a Harley-Davidson for a stuntman, or just being polite to fans. It was like the world was preparing itself to lose something very precious. We are so used to hearing bad news about famous people, stories of ego or bad behavior. But Keanu was different. He was the good guy. The idea that the good guy was hurting, maybe even dying, was too much for many people to handle. Somewhere in the middle of the night, the story reached a point where it couldn't be ignored anymore. Big entertainment news channels started picking it up. Reports circulating about Keanu Reeves. The headlines read. They were careful. They used words like allegedly and unconfirmed reports. But in the world of the internet, unconfirmed often just translates to it's happening. The views on these articles climbed into the millions. Everyone was searching for the same answer, hoping for an update that would say it was all a lie. But there was no update yet. The silence continued. And in that silence, the truth was sitting quietly in a hospital room, miles away from the screaming headlines and the panicking fans. The reality was not a movie plot. There was no dramatic explosion or car chase that led him there. It was something much simpler, much more common, and much more human. While the world imagined him fighting for his life on a breathing machine, the actual situation was far less dramatic, though still serious. The rumors had twisted a medical necessity into a tragedy. The ICU label had been attached to his story not because he was unconscious on the brink of death, but because that is where hospitals put people when they need to be watched very closely after procedure. It is a place of safety, not just a place of death. But the rumor mill didn't care about the details. It only cared about the shock value. The emotional toll on the fans was real. You could see it in the messages. "Please don't take him too," wrote one person, referring to the other great actors we have lost. "He is the nicest man in Hollywood." This was the core of the panic. It wasn't just about losing an actor. It was about losing a symbol of kindness in a world that often feels unkind. Keanu represents the idea that you can be famous and successful without losing your soul. The thought of that light being extinguished was a dark thought for many. As the night turned into morning, the frenzy didn't stop. If anything, it got louder. Every few minutes, someone would claim to have new information. My friend works at the hospital and says, followed by a story that was usually different from the last one. It was a storm of confusion, fueled by love and fear. People were refreshing their pages constantly, their fingers tapping anxiously on the glass, waiting for a sign. Nobody was sleeping. From the East Coast to the West, eyes were glued to screens. The story had taken on a life of its own. It had become a monster that fed on hope and dread. But underneath all the noise, the real story was waiting to be told. It wasn't a story of death. It wasn't a story of a tragic fall from grace. It was a story about a man who needed help, a man who was tired, and a man who was dealing with the heavy price of living a life dedicated to making other people feel good through his work. The truth was that Keanu was indeed in the hospital, but the ICU tag was a technicality, a precaution. He wasn't there because of a sudden crash. He was there because he had made a choice to fix a problem that had been bothering him for a long time. He had walked into the hospital on his own 2 feet, not carried in on a stretcher. But the internet didn't know that yet. The internet only knew fear. This disconnect between the loud, chaotic rumor and the quiet, sterile reality is what makes the story so heartfelt. It shows how much we project onto our heroes. We see them as giants who can withstand anything. When they show a crack in the armor, when they need a doctor, it scares us. It reminds us of our own fragility. As the sun began to come up over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the city, the rumor was still at its peak. The panic was at a high point. People were bracing themselves for the worst news possible. They were preparing statements of sadness. They were looking up old clips of his movies to watch one last time as a way to say goodbye. It was a massive emotional event, triggered by just a few sentences on a screen. But the morning light also brought the beginning of clarity. The hospital shift changed. The people who actually knew what was happening began to wake up. The truth was slow, but it was steady. It was getting ready to walk out of the sliding glass doors and meet the world. The truth wasn't going to be a headline about death. It was going to be a lesson about how quickly we assume the worst and how powerful a simple story can become when it is filled with love. This is where the story really begins, not with a tragedy, but with misunderstanding that revealed just how much the world cares about one human being. The rumor was a storm, but the reality was the calm center of it. And before the day was over, everyone would know the difference between a clickbait headline and a real life. But for now, in these early morning hours, the world held its breath, waiting, hoping, and praying for the man on the screen who had always been there for them to understand why he was really in the hospital. We have to look away from the computer screens and the gossip for a moment. We have to look at the man himself and the life he has lived. The rumors made it sound like a sudden, terrible event, like a bolt of lightning striking out a clear blue sky. People imagined he had just collapsed while walking down the street, or that a mystery illness had taken hold of him. But the truth was much slower than that. It was something that had been building up for years, like water pressing against a dam. Keanu Reeves has spent his entire adult life doing things that human bodies were not really designed to do. For decades, he has been our action hero. We watch him on giant screens, and we cheer. We see him jump from skyscrapers, fight off 10 bad guys at once, and crash cars at high speeds. In the movies, he gets up, brushes the dust off his jacket, and keeps running. He never seems to feel pain. He never seems to get tired. But that is the magic of movies. In real life, every punch he throws, every hard landing he makes, and every hour he spends hanging from a wire leaves a mark on the body. Think about what it takes to make those movies. It isn't just acting. It is physical labor. It is construction work, but with your own body. While the internet was busy panicking about him being in the intensive care unit, The reality was that he was dealing with the bill that had come due for all those years of entertainment. He hadn't been struck down by a random disease. He was dealing with a chronic, nagging injury that had simply refused to go away anymore. It is the kind of thing that happens to people who work hard with their hands and their backs. A carpenter might have bad knees from years of kneeling. A boxer might have shaky hands from the impacts. For an action star, the price is paid in the spine and the joints. This specific hospital visit was rooted in an old problem that had flared up aggressively. It wasn't life-threatening in the way the rumors said, but it was serious enough that he couldn't ignore it. The pain had become too loud to silence with just rest or simple medicine. There is a heartbreaking side to this that the rumors missed. The tragedy wasn't that he was dying. The tragedy was that he had pushed himself too far because he loves his job. He loves giving the audience a good show. He doesn't like to use stunt doubles for the big stuff, if he can help it. He wants to look us in the eye through the camera and say, "I did this for you." But over time, that dedication creates a map of scars and aches inside the body. The emergency was really just a moment where his body said, "Enough, we need to fix this now." So the surgery was planned. It was necessary. It was a procedure to correct a problem that had been bothering him for a long time. But anytime you go under anesthesia, especially when you're older and when the surgery is complex, there are risks. The doctors weren't treating a dying man. They were repairing a broken machine. And because of those risks, they needed to watch him very closely when he woke up. That is why he was in the ICU. The internet took the words intensive care unit and turned them into a death sentence. People heard those 3 letters and assumed the worst. They imagined tubes and wires and a last goodbye. But in the medical world, the ICU is often just a room with more nurses. It is a place where there is 1 nurse for every 1 or 2 patients, instead of 1 nurse for 5 patients. It is a place of safety. It is a place where you go when you need to be watched like a hawk while the anesthesia wears off. This distortion of the facts shows how hungry we are for drama. A story about a middle-aged man having surgery for a bad back or a worn-out joint isn't very exciting. It sounds normal. It sounds like something that happens to uncles and fathers and neighbors. But a story about an action hero fighting for his life in the ICU, that grabs your attention. That makes you click. So the truth got twisted to fit a better story. The real weight of the situation wasn't the medical danger. It was a realization that even our heroes have limits. We put these actors on pedestals. We think they are made of iron. We see them flying to the air in the Matrix movies or driving fast cars in the John Wick series. And we forget that they are just people. When the news broke, the fear came from a place of love, but also from a place of shock. We were shocked that the man who plays the immortal assassin could actually be hurt. Imagine carrying that weight. Imagine knowing that millions of people are worried about you, but knowing that the reason they're worried is a misunderstanding. The real pain he was feeling wasn't just from the surgery. It was the knowledge that his body, the tool of his trade, was starting to show its age. It is a heavy feeling for anyone who loves their work. One day, you are on top of the world, doing things no one else can do. The next day, you are lying in a hospital bed, waiting for your vital signs to stabilize so you can go home and rest. The narrative of a tragic collapse was easier for people to believe than the narrative of wear and tear. Collapse is quick. Wear and tear is slow. Wear and tear is something we all face, but we don't want to see it in our idols. We want them to stay young forever. We want them to keep running and jumping. But biology doesn't care about box office numbers or fan adoration. Bones get brittle. Discs in the spine slip. Cartilage wears thin. This part of the story is where we need to have empathy. It isn't about a celebrity scandal. It is about a human being dealing with the physical cost of his life's work. He wasn't in the ICU because of a sudden accident. He was there because he had spent a lifetime slamming his body into the ground for our amusement. And eventually, the ground pushes back. The surgery was the price tag for all those movies we love so much. As the doctors and nurses moved around him, checking the monitors and adjusting the medication, there was no panic in the room. There was professionalism and care. They knew the truth. They knew he wasn't a tragic figure. He was just a patient who needed a repair job. They fixed him up. They monitored his heart rate and his breathing to make sure the anesthesia didn't cause any problems. It was routine, high-level care. It was the best place to be. But it wasn't a death scene. The ICU rumor had painted a picture of fragility, like a vase shattering on the floor. But the reality was durability. It was the story of a body that had taken a beating for 40 years and was finally getting the maintenance it required. It was less like a tragedy and more like a pit stop for a race car that has been driven too hard for too long. The car isn't broken forever. It just needs new tires and an engine check before it can get back on the track. So, while the world wept and prayed, thinking the end was near, the actual situation was much more grounded. It was a man dealing with pain. It was a man accepting that he needs help. It was a man willing to go through a scary surgery to fix a problem, so he could keep living his life. That isn't a sad story. In a way, it is an inspiring one. It shows that even when you are hurting, even when your body is telling you to stop, you find the courage to fix what is broken and keep going. The truth was hidden behind a curtain of speculation, but the facts were simple. No mystery disease. No terrible accident. Just a lifetime of action catching up to him. He was in the ICU to be safe, not because he was dying. And as the night went on, the medical team did their job perfectly. They stabilized him. They managed his pain. They moved him from the critical phase into the recovery phase. The monster that the internet had created in their minds was nowhere to be found in that quiet, sterile room. There was just a tired man, sleeping off the effects of the medicine, waiting for the chance to heal. Inside the hospital, the world was completely different. While the internet outside was exploding with panic and rumors, the atmosphere inside these walls was incredibly quiet. There was no shouting, no drama, and no chaos. It was a place of soft beeps and humming machines. The rumors had painted a picture of a terrifying emergency room scene, with doctors running and lights flashing, but the reality was much more still. It was a peaceful, sterile environment where the only thing happening was a slow, steady work of healing. The room where he lay was small, but modern. It wasn't a dark, scary dungeon. The walls were a calm, neutral color, and the air was cool and smelled clean, like antiseptic and wash linen. Separating him from the busy hallway was not a heavy, imposing barrier that slammed shut, but a sleek sliding glass partition. It was transparent and simple. From the bed, he could see the nurse's station just a short distance away. He could see people moving around in scrubs, drinking coffee, and looking at monitors. It was comforting to see them. It reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were people right there keeping an eye on him. This was an intensive care unit that had terrified so many people online. But in reality, it was just a room with a little extra attention. It wasn't a place where people go to die. It was a place where they go to wake up safely. The machines around the bed were not screaming alarms. They were making rhythmic, gentle sounds. A heart monitor blinked a steady green light with every beat. A pump beside the bed pushed medicine into his veins with soft, whirring noise. These machines weren't enemies fighting against him. They were helpers, working to keep him comfortable while his body did the hard work of repairing itself. Keanu was lying still, covered in light blankets. The anesthesia from the surgery was wearing off slowly. It doesn't happen all at once, like flipping a switch. It is more like rising from the bottom of a deep lake. You are in the dark for a long time, and then slowly, shapes and sounds start to filter back in. His mind was foggy. He felt heavy, like his limbs were made of lead. His throat was dry and sore from the breathing tube they had used during the operation. It is an uncomfortable feeling, waking up from surgery. You feel confused. You don't know what time it is or where you are at first. You just have a vague sense that something happened, and now you are safe. As he drifted closer to consciousness, he opened his eyes just a little bit. The light above him was soft, not harsh. He blinked a few times, trying to focus. He wasn't looking at a battlefield or a movie set. He was looking at a white ceiling tile. There was a small, hairline crack running to the paint of that tile. It was a tiny imperfection, but he stared at it. It was a real thing. It was solid. It grounded him. He wasn't invincible John Wick right then. He wasn't the superhero Neo. He was just a man with a sore neck and a blurry mind, staring at a crack in the ceiling. A nurse noticed a movement on the monitor. She walked into the room, her shoes making a squeaky sound on the clean linoleum floor. She didn't rush. She moved with the calm confidence of someone who does this every day. She came to the side of the bed and looked down at him. She didn't look starstruck or scared. She just looked professional and kind. She checked the numbers on the screens above his head. She checked the bandages on his body. He tried to move his head, but the nurse gently put a hand on his shoulder to stop him. She leaned in close, so he could hear her without her having to shout. She told him that the surgery was over. She told him that everything had gone according to plan. She told him he was in the recovery unit and he was doing fine. Her voice was low and soothing. It cut through the fog in his brain. He didn't try to speak because his throat hurt too much. He just looked at her with his eyes and gave a small, slow nod. He understood. It was a very human moment. The world saw him as an icon, a figure of strength and violence on screen. But right here, he was vulnerable. He needed help just to get a sip of water. He needed someone to adjust his blankets. He was at the mercy of the kindness of strangers. And the strange thing was, he seemed grateful for it. There was no anger in his eyes, no frustration at his weakness. There was just a simple acceptance. He knew he was in good hands. The nurse adjusted his pillow, fluffing it up to make him more comfortable. She asked him if he was in pain, and he squeezed her hand once to say yes, a little. She didn't disappear. She went to computer, typed something in, and within a few moments, the pain pump kicked in. The medicine washed over him, taking the sharp edge off the soreness in his body. He let out a long breath and relaxed into the mattress. For a while, he just drifted there. He was awake enough to know where he was, but asleep enough to rest. He watched the nurses through the glass partition. He saw them talking softly to each other. He saw them answering phones. It was a normal day for them. They were saving lives and helping people heal, and to them, he was just another patient who needed care. There was something very nice about that. In the outside world, he couldn't go anywhere without a crowd gathering. Inside here, he was anonymous. He was just a human being receiving the gift of care. The ICU label had made everyone think of tragedy, but this room was actually a sanctuary. It was a bubble of safety where the demands of the world couldn't touch him. The phones were off. The emails weren't coming in. The script deadlines didn't exist. It was just him, the beep of the monitor, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. It was a forced pause. In a life that moves at 1,000,000 miles an hour, this was the one time he had to stop. He didn't have a choice. His body had put his foot down and said, "We are stopping here." As the hours went by, the fog in his mind started to lift more. He began to feel more like himself. He started to remember why he was there. He thought about the injury, the pain he had been in before the surgery, and the hope that this would fix it. He felt a sense of relief. The worst part was over. The part where they cut into you and put you to sleep was done. Now, the only job he had was to rest. That was a job he was willing to do. Eventually, another staff member came in to check on him. It was a younger person, maybe an assistant or a student, who was helping with the cleaning and the equipment. They moved quietly around the room, emptying a small bin and wiping down a surface. They were trying not to disturb him, but he watched them. When they were done, they turned to leave. He caught their eye for a second. He didn't say anything, but he raised his hand just a little bit off the bed and gave a thumbs up. It was a small gesture, but it meant, "Thank you." The person smiled back, surprised and happy, and gave a small nod before walking out through the sliding glass door. That interaction said more about him than any movie role could. Even in a groggy, painful state, he took a second to acknowledge another person. He didn't act like he was entitled to their service. He acted like they were doing him a favor, which they were. This was the truth behind the headlines. The internet was arguing about whether he was dead or alive, debating the severity of his condition, but the real story was playing out in these tiny, quiet exchanges. The real story was about a man treating the people around him with dignity, even when he felt weak. The room started to get darker as the evening set in outside. The lights in the hallway were dimmed. The hospital was shifting into its night rhythm. It became even quieter. The beeping seemed to slow down, or maybe he was just getting used to it. He closed his eyes again. He wasn't afraid. He felt safe in this box of glass and light. He was far away from the noise of the world. He was just a man, sleeping and healing, waiting for the morning to come so, He could start the journey back to his life. The panic outside the walls had no power here. Inside, there was only peace. The most heartbreaking and beautiful parts of this story didn't have anything to do with the medical charts or the monitors. They weren't about the surgery or the rumors swirling outside on the internet. The real moments, the ones that actually mattered, were about his character. While the world was busy painting a picture of a tragic figure who was broken and helpless, the reality inside that room was very different. It was a demonstration of a strength that has nothing to do with muscles or action movies. It was the strength of being a good person when you don't feel good at all. As the day went on, the fog of the anesthesia lifted more and more. Keanu became more alert. With alertness came the discomfort. Waking up after major surgery isn't pleasant. There is pain, there is stiffness, and there is a deep sense of exhaustion that settles into your bones. Most people, when they are in that state, get cranky. It is natural to be irritable when you hurt. It is easy to snap at the people around you because you are scared and uncomfortable. But he didn't do that. A nurse came in to check his vitals and adjust his foreline. She was busy, rushing a little bit because there were other patients who needed her too. As she moved around the bed, she accidentally bumped the mattress, jarring his leg. He winced visibly. It was a sharp, clear reaction to pain. The nurse froze, immediately apologizing, looking worried that she had caused him suffering. She expected him to be annoyed. She expected him to complain. Instead, he took a shallow breath and shook his head slightly. He looked her in the eye and mouthed the words, "It's okay." He actually apologized to her for being in the way. He treated her like she was the one doing him a massive favor, rather than him just being a patient receiving care. That was the moment the truth really started to show itself. The rumor was that he was fragile, crumbling under the weight of his own life. But seeing him there, apologizing for being in pain, you realize just how wrong the rumors were. He wasn't fragile. He was polite to a fault. Even when his body was screaming at him, his first instinct was to make sure the nurse didn't feel bad. That isn't something you can fake. That isn't acting. That is just who he is. Later in the shift, a different staff member came into the room. It was someone who worked behind the scenes, a person whose job is to clean the floors and keep the environment tidy. This person isn't usually the center of attention in a hospital. Often, they're invisible. People walk right past them without saying a word. But Keanu watched him. He watched the man sweep the floor and empty the small trash bin in the corner. The man was trying to be quiet, so he wouldn't disturb the famous patient in the bed. When the man turned to leave, Keanu stopped him. He raised his hand a little bit to get his attention. The man looked surprised, maybe even a little nervous, wondering if the room was too cold or if the floor was too loud. But Keanu just wanted to say thank you. He nodded at him and gave a genuine smile of gratitude. It was a small thing, a simple interaction, but it meant the world to that worker. To be seen, to be acknowledged by a patient who is suffering, is a rare thing. It showed that he doesn't distinguish between the person performing the surgery and the person cleaning the room. To him, they were both human beings helping him get through a hard time. This behavior completely dismantled the narrative of the tragic hero. The internet was crying over him, imagining him as this poor, sad soul who was wasting away. But he wasn't wasting away. He was engaging with the world around him with kindness. He was turning a situation that was all about his own pain into a situation where he was making other people feel appreciated. It was a powerful lesson in humility. We often think that strength means being tough and not showing weakness. But real strength is being kind even when you are weak. The doctors came in and out, checking the surgical site, explaining the healing process. They used big medical words and talked about timelines for recovery. He listened intently. He didn't act like a celebrity who demanded special treatment or shortcuts. He listened like a student who wanted to learn how to get better. He asked questions. He wanted to know what he could do to help the process. He took ownership of his own recovery. There was no ego in the room. There was no, "I am Keanu Reeves, fix me now." It was just a partnership between a patient and his healers. There was a quiet moment in the late afternoon where the room was empty for a few minutes. The sun was coming through the blinds in stripes across the bed. He lay there, just looking at the light. You could see the weight of the situation on his face then. He wasn't smiling for the nurses. He wasn't being polite for the staff. He was just a man, alone with his thoughts. He had to process what this meant. It meant time away from work. It meant physical therapy. It meant accepting that he isn't 25 anymore. It was a heavy moment, but it wasn't a sad one. It was just honest. He was facing the reality of his own mortality. The same reality we all have to face eventually. That is the most human-centric part of this whole story. We often put celebrities on a pedestal and think they are immune to the struggles of normal life. We think they have magic cures or special pills. But lying in that bed, looking at the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, he was dealing with the exact same feelings anyone else would have in that situation. He was tired. He was sore. He was ready to go home. He missed his own life. He wasn't a myth. He was a person. The truth that the headlines missed was that his kindness was far more durable than his action star image. The rumors focused on his body, his heart, his lungs, his injury. But the real story was his heart, in the emotional sense. The way he treated the people in that room proved that he hasn't let the world change him. Fame can make people bitter. It can make them feel entitled. It can make them forget where they came from. But the pain of the ICU stripped all of that away. When you're flat on your back in a hospital gown, you don't have an image to protect. You only have your true self to offer. And his true self is incredibly decent. As the shift changed and evening approached, the nurses gathered at the station for a moment. They talked about the patient in room 4. They didn't gossip about him. They talked about how nice he was. In a job where you see people at their worst, where you get yelled at and blamed for things that aren't your fault, having a patient who is genuinely kind is a gift. It restores your faith in humanity a little bit. They went back into his room not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They wanted to check on him because he made them feel good about their jobs. This is the part of the story that makes you love him even more. It's easy to love the movie star who saved the world on screen, but it is deeper to love the man who says thank you to a janitor while he is recovering from surgery. It's real. It's grounded. It cuts through all the noise of the internet and the rumors. The panic outside was about losing an icon. The peace inside was about appreciating a human being. The narrative of the ICU had painted him as a victim of circumstance, someone battered by the storms of life. But watching him interact with the people caring for him, you realized he wasn't a victim. He was a fighter, just not in the way we are used to seeing. He was fighting to maintain his dignity and his kindness in the face of pain and discomfort, and he was winning. He was winning simply by being a good person when it would have been so easy to be anything else. By the time the night settled in, the truth was clear to everyone in that hallway. There was no mystery illness. There was no tragic decline. There was just a good man having a bad day physically, but handling it with more grace than most people could ever hope to muster. The rumors had tried to break him down into a headline, but his character had built him back up into something real. He wasn't the dying hero of a tragic news story. He was just Keanu, being Keanu, making the world a little softer, even when he was the one hurting the most. The moment finally arrived when the doctors decided he was strong enough to leave. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment where he rips the IVs out his arms and walks out in slow motion. It was much quieter than that. It was a slow, methodical process. A nurse came in and carefully removed the needles from the back of his hand. She placed small bandages over the tiny spots where the medicine had been flowing into his veins. She helped him sit up on the edge of the bed. He moved slowly, testing his balance. His body felt stiff, and the incision site was sore, but he was upright. That was a victory. He was standing on his own 2 feet. He reached for the clothes he had worn when he first came in. They had been folded neatly on a chair in the corner. Putting them on felt like a milestone. It was the act of stepping out of the role of patient and going back to being a regular person. He buttoned his shirt with fingers that were still a little bit clumsy from the anesthesia. He tied his shoes. These were normal, boring tasks that usually nobody thinks about, but today they felt like accomplishments. He wasn't an action hero completing a mission. He was just a man getting dressed to go home. When he was ready, he didn't make a big speech. He didn't thank everyone with a grand gesture. He just looked at the nurse and the doctor who were standing by the door. He gave them a sincere nod. It was a look that said, "I wouldn't be here without you." They smiled back, happy to see him leaving. There was a sense of relief in the room that went beyond just medical success. It was a relief of seeing a nice person get a break. He grabbed a small bag with his personal items and turned toward the exit. The walk out of the hospital was the final step of this journey. He didn't walk down a long, dark hallway with a heavy door at the end. Instead, he walked toward the main entrance. As he approached, the automatic glass doors sensed him coming and slid open smoothly. They didn't slam shut behind him with a bang. They just sealed quietly. He stepped from the cool, sterile air of the hospital into the bright, warm sun of a California afternoon. The light hit his face, and he squinted slightly, adjusting to the change. Outside, the world was waiting. The rumor mill had been churning for days, and now the reality was here. There were a few photographers waiting across the street. They had their cameras raised, hoping for a shot of the tragic star. But what they saw was not a tragedy. They saw a man who looked tired but alive. He was wearing a simple cap pulled low over his eyes and a jacket that shielded his body. He didn't look like he was on the brink of death. He looked like someone who had just had a long week and wanted to go home and sleep. He didn't stop to talk to them. He didn't hold a press conference on the sidewalk to explain his medical history. He just kept walking. A car was waiting at the curb, the engine idling softly. He opened the back door and slid inside. It was a quiet, unassuming car. It wasn't a flashy ambulance with sirens blaring. It was just a ride. As the door clicked shut, the noise of the street was cut off. He was safe again. The driver merged into flow of traffic. And within seconds, the hospital was just a building in the rear-view mirror. Back in the digital world, the news spread fast. Keanu Reeves discharged. The actors recovering at home. The headlines that had been screaming emergency and ICU suddenly changed their tune. The panic that had gripped millions of people began to loosen its grip. The collective breath that the internet had been holding for days was finally released. The comment section shifted from prayers and goodbyes to messages of relief. "Thank goodness," people wrote. "I knew he would be okay. Get some rest, Keanu." The truth that the title promised wasn't some shocking secret. It wasn't a cover-up for something worse. The truth was boring and beautiful all at the same time. The truth was that he had a medical issue. He got it fixed, and now he was going to rest. The story of the ICU was just a scary shadow cast by a very normal medical event. The machine of the internet had tried to turn a routine surgery into a Greek tragedy, but reality had won out in the end. What this whole experience really showed us was how fragile our perception of celebrities is. We build them up in our minds to be larger than life. We think they are immune to the things that hurt us. When we hear they are in the hospital, we assume it must be catastrophic. We can't imagine them lying in a bed with a sore back or a bum knee, because that is too ordinary. We want them to be fighting supervillains, not recovering from operations. But this story broke that illusion. It brought him down to earth. It reminded us that he bleeds, he hurts, and he needs doctors just like the rest of us. As his car drove through the city streets, he probably looked out the window at the world passing by. Life was going on. People were walking their dogs. Coffee shops were open. Traffic lights were turning red and green. The world hadn't stopped spinning because he was in the hospital, and it wouldn't start spinning faster just because he was out. There's a humble lesson in that. We are all just part of the big picture. Even a global icon is just a passenger in a car on a Tuesday afternoon. The most heartfelt part of the conclusion isn't that he survived. We always knew he was a fighter. The most heartfelt part is how he handled it. He didn't come out angry at the rumors. He didn't release a statement scolding the media for lying. He just went home. He didn't add more noise to the chaos. He just chose peace. That silence spoke volumes. It showed that he knows the difference between what is real and what is just noise on the internet. The rumors were noise. His health and his peace of mind were what was real. When he finally got home, the real healing would begin. Hospital surgery fixes the immediate problem, but the real work takes time. It takes days of lying on the couch. It takes physical therapy. It takes patience. It is the slow, unglamorous work of getting better. There is no audience for that part. There are no cameras recording the small victories of walking from the couch to the kitchen without wincing. That is the private battle that millions of people fight every day alone in their homes. Now, he was one of them. The story we all lived through during those few days of panic wasn't really about a celebrity health scare. It was a reflection of our own fears. We were scared of losing a symbol of goodness. The truth is that we don't need to be scared. His kindness isn't tied to his physical ability to jump off a building. His resilience isn't about how many punches he can take. His true strength is in his character, and you don't lose that in a hospital operating room. That part of him is intact. That part of him is stronger than ever. So, the rumor dies out. The trending topics change. The internet moves on to the next big story. But for the people who really watch the story unfold, who look past the headlines, something remains. There's a deeper appreciation for the man behind the movies. We saw a glimpse of the human being. We saw him vulnerable, we saw him polite, and we saw him walking out into the sun. It was a reminder that the heroes we love are just people doing a job. And sometimes people need to take a break to fix what is broken. The car turned a corner and disappeared from view. The ICU story was over. There was no cliffhanger, no sequel planned. Just a man going home to rest, leaving the world a little less worried than it was a day before. And in a world that often feels full of bad news and confusion, a happy ending like that is the only truth we really need. He wasn't a tragedy. He was just recovering. And that was enough.